I was staring at the invoice, taped to my front door, when I realized the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association had finally lost their minds completely. The paper fluttered in the cold February wind sweeping through my neighborhood in Boulder, Colorado, and the number at the bottom made my blood boil more than any blizzard could freeze it. $375 for mandatory snow removal services I never requested, never agreed to, and definitely never needed. My name is Yates Jennings, and I have been living in this house for 5 years without a single problem, until Patricia Morrison became the HOA president 8 months ago. Patricia was everything you would expect from a woman who wore velour tracksuits to neighborhood meetings and treated the HOA bylaws like they were handed down from Mount Sinai. She had that particular haircut that screamed she wanted to speak to the manager, highlighted blonde with the choppy layers that seemed to defy gravity and common sense simultaneously. I crumpled the invoice in my fist and walked back inside my house, throwing it onto the kitchen counter next to my coffee mug. The whole situation was absurd. I had a snowblower, and I had been clearing my own driveway and walkway every single time it snowed, which in Boulder meant pretty regularly during winter. The snow removal service Patricia hired was for people who wanted it, or at least that was what the initial email had said back in November. My phone buzzed on the counter, a text from my neighbor Marcus Chen, who lived 3 houses down. "Did you get the bill too? This is insane," I typed back quickly. "Yeah, just found it. I'm not paying for something I didn't use." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. "Patricia is saying it's mandatory now. She sent out an email last night." I opened my email app and scrolled through until I found it. Sure enough, there was a message from Patricia Morrison, sent at 11:30 the previous night with the subject line, "Mandatory Snow Removal Assessment." I opened it and read through the wall of text that somehow managed to be both condescending and barely coherent at the same time. According to Patricia, the HOA board had voted to make the snow removal service mandatory for all residents to maintain uniformity and property values in the neighborhood. Anyone who refused to pay would face fines, and continued refusal would result in legal action. The email concluded with a reminder that all residents had agreed to follow HOA rules when they purchased their homes. I set my phone down and walked over to my home office, where I kept all my important documents in a fireproof safe. I pulled out the folder containing my property deed and the original HOA documents I had received when I bought the house. I had read through them carefully back then, because I had heard enough horror stories about HOAs to know they could make your life miserable if you were not careful. It took me about 20 minutes of reading through the dense legal language, but I found exactly what I was looking for. My property, along with 4 other lots in the neighborhood, had a specific easement designation that predated the HOA by almost 30 years. The land had originally been part of a larger ranch property that was subdivided in the 1980s, and certain lots maintained specific rights that could not be superseded by the HOA. One of those rights was the explicit autonomy over snow removal and landscaping maintenance without HOA interference. I took a picture of the relevant section of the deed with my phone and sent it to Marcus. Found something interesting. My lot has an easement that exempts me from this kind of mandatory service. His response came back almost immediately. "Lucky you, the rest of us are screwed." I did not feel lucky. I felt angry. Patricia had to have known about these easements when she pushed through her mandatory snow removal policy, which meant she was either incompetent or deliberately trying to squeeze money out of people who did not know their rights. Neither option was acceptable. The next morning, I drove to the HOA office, which was located in a small strip mall on the edge of the neighborhood. Patricia held office hours every Tuesday and Thursday morning, and I wanted to resolve this in person before it escalated further. The office was cramped and smelled like stale coffee and cheap air freshener. Patricia sat behind a desk that was too large for the space, surrounded by stacks of binders and file folders that looked like they had not been organized since the Nixon administration. "Yates," she said, not looking up from her computer. "I assume you are here about the snow removal fee." "I am," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm not paying it. I handle my own snow removal, and according to my property deed, I'm exempt from mandatory services like this." Patricia finally looked at me, and her expression was the perfect mixture of annoyance and condescension. "Everyone thinks they're special, Yates. The HOA board voted on this policy, and it applies to all residents. No exceptions." I pulled out a copy of my deed and placed it on her desk. "This is not about being special. This is about legal property rights. My lot has an easement that predates the HOA. You cannot enforce this fee on my property." She glanced at the paper like it was contaminated. "I'll have our lawyer look at it, but I'm confident the HOA authority supersedes any old easements. You still need to pay the fee by the end of the week, or you will be assessed additional fines." "Patricia, this is not a negotiation. I'm showing you documentation that proves I'm exempt. If you try to fine me, I'll contest it." She stood up, which I think was supposed to be intimidating, but since she was about 5'3" and I was 6'1", it just made the whole thing more absurd. "The HOA has rules, Yates. If everyone just decided which rules they wanted to follow, we would have chaos. Pay the fee or deal with the consequences." I took my deed back and left without another word. There was no point arguing with someone who had already made up their mind. I spent the rest of the day working from home, writing code for the software company I worked for remotely. But my mind kept drifting back to the HOA situation. By evening, I had decided to send a formal letter to the HOA board explaining my position and providing copies of the relevant sections of my deed. I drafted the letter carefully, keeping it professional but firm, and sent it via certified mail to the HOA office and to each board member individually. In the letter, I explained the easement, cited the specific language in my deed, and made it clear that I would not be paying the snow removal fee. I also requested a response within 10 business days. 3 days later, instead of a response, I got another notice on my door. This one informed me that I was being fined $200 for non-compliance with HOA policies, and if I did not pay both the original fee and the fine within 7 days, the total would increase to $800, and the HOA would pursue legal action. I called Marcus that evening, and he told me that several other residents were in the same boat. Nobody wanted to pay for a service they had not used, but most people were planning to pay anyway rather than fight the HOA. The general attitude was that it was not worth the hassle, even if it was not fair. "You should just pay it," Marcus said. "I know it sucks, but Patricia will make your life hell if you keep pushing back." "That's exactly why I'm not paying," I said. "If we let her get away with this, she'll just keep finding new ways to squeeze money out of everyone. Someone has to stand up to her." "Good luck with that, man. Let me know how it works out." I did not pay the fee and I did not pay the fine. Instead, I started documenting everything. I took photos of my driveway every time I cleared the snow myself. I saved every email, every notice, every communication from the HOA. I also reached out to a real estate attorney named David Kowalski, who specialized in property disputes. I explained the situation and sent him copies of my deed and the HOA bylaws. David called me back the next day. "You have a solid case," he said. "The easement is clearly documented, and it specifically exempts you from mandatory maintenance services. The HOA is going to have a hard time arguing against this. So what do I do? Wait for them to make the next move. If they take you to court, we'll respond with a motion to dismiss based on the easement. If they try to put a lien on your property, we can challenge that too. Just keep documenting everything and do not engage with them directly unless you have to." I followed his advice, but Patricia was not done. 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday afternoon, I was in the middle of a video conference with my team when I heard a knock at my door. I muted myself and went to answer it, expecting maybe a package delivery or a neighbor. Instead, I found 2 police officers standing on my porch. "Yates Jennings?" one of them asked. He was an older guy, probably in his 50s, with gray hair and a tired expression. "That's me." "What's this about?" "We received a complaint from your HOA president about unpaid fees and trespassing. She says you're violating community rules and refusing to leave HOA property." I stared at him, trying to process what I was hearing. "Trespassing? I'm standing in my own house." "What HOA property am I supposedly trespassing on?" The other officer, younger and looking like he would rather be anywhere else, consulted his notepad. "According to the complaint, you're using common area snow removal equipment without authorization and refusing to pay the required fees." "I have never used any HOA equipment. I have my own snowblower. I clear my own property. This is completely false." The older officer sighed. "Look, we're just following up on the complaint. Do you have any proof that you're not using their equipment?" I pulled out my phone and showed them the photos I had been taking of my driveway and my snowblower. "I've been documenting everything because the HOA is trying to force me to pay for a service I don't use and aren't legally required to pay for. My property has an easement that exempts me from mandatory HOA services." The officers looked at each other, and I could see the realization dawning on them that they had been pulled into a petty neighborhood dispute. The older one handed me a business card. "If the HOA has an issue with you, they need to handle it through civil court, not by filing false police reports. If she calls again with something like this, let us know." After they left, I was shaking with anger. Patricia had actually called the police on me, filing what amounted to a false report, just to harass me into paying her bogus fee. I immediately called David Kowalski and told him what happened. "That was a mistake on her part," David said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Filing a false police report to harass you into compliance could open her up to legal consequences. Save everything related to that police visit. We might need it." 2 days later, I received a summons. The HOA was taking me to small claims court for unpaid fees and fines totaling $1,200. The court date was set for 3 weeks out. I met with David at his office to prepare. He was in his early 40s, with dark hair starting to gray at the temples and the confident demeanor of someone who had fought and won these kinds of battles before. "Small claims is actually good for us," he explained. "It's faster, less formal, and judges in small claims tend to have less patience for HOA overreach. Bring your deed, bring all the documentation you have, and bring those photos of the police visit. We're going to make it very clear that the HOA is acting outside its authority." The 3 weeks crawled by. Patricia sent 2 more threatening letters, each one more aggressive than the last. She sent emails to the entire neighborhood warning about the consequences of not following HOA rules, clearly directed at me without actually using my name. A few neighbors stopped by to express their support quietly, but most people just kept their distance. Nobody wanted to be the next target. Marcus texted me the night before the court date. Heard about tomorrow. Hope it goes well. For what it's worth, a lot of us are rooting for you even if we are not saying it publicly. The courthouse was in downtown Boulder, a modern building that tried to blend contemporary architecture with the historic character of the area. I arrived early with David, and we went over our strategy one more time in the hallway outside the courtroom. Patricia showed up 15 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to start, accompanied by another board member, a man named Gerald Thatcher, who always looked like he had just smelled something unpleasant. Patricia was dressed in what I assumed was her version of professional attire, a navy blue pantsuit that did not quite fit right and too much jewelry. She glared at me from across the hallway, and I ignored her, focusing instead on the notes David had prepared. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Judge Rebecca Hartwell, and from the moment we entered her courtroom, I could tell she had seen every kind of petty dispute imaginable and had no patience for nonsense. She called the case, and Patricia immediately stood up, ready to launch into her prepared speech. "Sit down, please," Judge Hartwell said, her voice firm but not unkind. "I'll let you know when it's your turn to speak. I've reviewed the filings from both parties, and I have some questions before we proceed." Patricia sat down, looking slightly deflated. Judge Hartwell looked at the papers in front of her. "Miss Morrison, you're here representing the Riverside Meadows HOA, claiming that Mr. Jennings owes fees for snow removal services and fines for non-compliance. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Patricia said. "Mr. Jennings has repeatedly refused to pay his fair share for services that benefit the entire community. His actions undermine the authority of the HOA and set a bad precedent for other residents. And Mr. Jennings, you're claiming that you're exempt from these fees based on an easement in your property deed. Is that correct?" David stood. "That's correct, Your Honor. We have documentation showing that Mr. Jennings's property has specific rights that predate the HOA and cannot be superseded by HOA policies. I'd like to see that documentation." David approached the bench and handed Judge Hartwell copies of my deed, highlighted to show the relevant sections. He also provided copies of the original subdivision documents from the 1980s and the HOA bylaws. Judge Hartwell spent several minutes reading through everything, her expression neutral. Finally, she looked up at Patricia. "Miss Morrison, were you aware of this easement when you instituted the mandatory snow removal policy?" Patricia shifted in her seat. "I was aware that some properties had old easements, but our lawyer assured us that HOA authority would take precedence in matters of community maintenance." "Did your lawyer specifically review Mr. Jennings's deed before you sent him the bill?" "I don't recall if we looked at that specific property." Judge Hartwell's expression hardened slightly. "So you instituted a mandatory fee without verifying whether all properties in your jurisdiction were actually subject to that fee?" "We acted in good faith, Your Honor. The policy was designed to benefit everyone." "That doesn't answer my question, Miss Morrison." Judge Hartwell turned to David. "Do you have anything else you want me to consider?" "Yes, Your Honor. We'd like to submit evidence that the HOA has engaged in harassment of Mr. Jennings, including filing a false police report claiming he was trespassing on HOA property." David handed over the police report, copies of my photos showing I had been clearing my own snow, and the business card the officer had given me. Judge Hartwell read through the police report, and I saw her eyebrows raise slightly. She looked at Patricia. "You filed a police report claiming Mr. Jennings was using HOA equipment without authorization. He was refusing to cooperate with HOA policies, Your Honor. We felt it was a law enforcement matter. Based on what evidence? Patricia did not have a good answer for that. She stammered something about community standards and proper procedures, but it was clear she had not thought through the implications of calling the police on a homeowner for a civil dispute. Judge Hartwell set the papers down and leaned back in her chair. Here's what I see. Mr. Jennings has a clearly documented easement that exempts his property from mandatory HOA maintenance services. The HOA instituted a policy without properly vetting which properties were actually subject to that policy. When Mr. Jennings refused to pay, the HOA responded with escalating fines and harassment, including filing what appears to be a false police report. Miss Morrison, do you have any legal basis for claiming that your HOA authority supersedes a recorded easement that predates the HOA by decades? Patricia looked at Gerald, who just shook his head slightly. Your Honor, we were just trying to maintain community standards. That's not a legal argument, Miss Morrison. The easement is clear, it's recorded, and it's legally binding. The HOA had no authority to impose this fee on Mr. Jennings's property. Judge Hartwell paused, and I saw something that might have been amusement flicker across her face. In fact, I'm trying to understand how this case even made it to my courtroom. Did anyone at the HOA actually read Mr. Jennings's deed before filing this lawsuit? The silence from Patricia's side of the courtroom was answer enough. This case is dismissed with prejudice, Judge Hartwell said firmly. Mr. Jennings owes nothing to the HOA for snow removal fees or associated fines. Furthermore, I'm ordering the HOA to reimburse Mr. Jennings for his attorney fees and court costs. Miss Morrison, I strongly suggest you consult with a qualified real estate attorney before instituting any more mandatory policies, because if I see another case like this come across my desk, I'm going to start questioning whether your board is acting in good faith at all. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Patricia looked like she had been slapped. Gerald was staring at the floor, probably calculating how much this was going to cost the HOA. But Judge Hartwell was not done. One more thing. I'm referring this matter to the Boulder Police Department for review. Filing false police reports is a criminal offense, and if the police determine that Miss Morrison filed a report knowing it was false for the purpose of harassment, that's something they'll need to address. This court is adjourned. We left the courtroom, and I could hear Patricia arguing with Gerald in heated whispers behind us. David put a hand on my shoulder. That went even better than I expected. Judge Hartwell saw right through the HOA's tactics. What happens now with the police report thing? The judge will send her order to the police department, and they'll review it. If they decide to pursue charges, they'll investigate. At minimum, it's going to be on record that the HOA filed a false report, which could help if there are any future disputes. We walked out of the courthouse into the bright Colorado sunshine. I felt lighter than I had in weeks. That evening, I sent a message to Marcus and a few other neighbors who had been following the situation, letting them know what happened. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Several people told me they were proud that someone had finally stood up to Patricia, and a few mentioned they were going to start looking more carefully at their own deeds and the HOA bylaws. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. 3 days after the court hearing, I got a call from Detective Sarah Martinez with the Boulder Police Department. She wanted to meet with me to discuss the false police report. We met at a coffee shop near the courthouse, and she explained that they were opening an investigation into Patricia's conduct. The problem we have, Detective Martinez explained, is that filing a false police report is usually a misdemeanor, and it's hard to prove intent. We need to show that, Miss Morrison knew the report was false when she filed it, and that she did it with malicious intent. She knew I wasn't using HOA equipment, I said. I had already told her I was clearing my own snow. She just wanted to harass me into paying. Can you prove that? Do you have documentation of telling her that before she filed the report? I pulled out my phone and showed her the email chain where I had explicitly told Patricia I was handling my own snow removal. I also showed her the certified letters I had sent to the HOA board. Detective Martinez took notes and asked if she could have copies of everything. "This helps," she said. "I'm also going to talk to the officers who responded to the call. If they noted in their report that your story was credible, and you had proof you weren't using HOA equipment, that strengthens the case that Miss Morrison's report was false." Over the next 2 weeks, the investigation continued. I learned from Marcus that several other residents had come forward with complaints about Patricia's behavior. Apparently, I was not the only one she had harassed. There were stories of threatened fines for minor violations, aggressive letters about lawn care, and one incident where she had tried to prevent a resident from installing solar panels, even though state law protected their right to do so. The HOA board called an emergency meeting, and word got out that several board members were pushing for Patricia to resign. She refused, claiming she had done nothing wrong and was just enforcing the rules. The meeting turned into a shouting match, and 3 board members ended up resigning in protest. Meanwhile, Detective Martinez called me again. "We're moving forward with charges. The district attorney agrees that there's enough evidence to charge Miss Morrison with filing a false police report and criminal harassment. She'll be formally charged next week." I did not feel victorious. I felt exhausted. All I had wanted was to be left alone to clear my own driveway, and it had turned into this massive legal battle that was now involving criminal charges. But at the same time, I knew that if Patricia was willing to do this to me, she would do it to other people. Someone had to stop her. The news about the criminal charges spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Patricia's supporters, the handful of residents who thought she was just doing her job, started a petition to support her. It got maybe 20 signatures out of a neighborhood of 200 homes. Most people just wanted the drama to end. Patricia was formally charged 3 weeks after our court hearing. She was arrested at her home early one morning, which I only knew about because Marcus texted me a photo of the police car parked outside her house. She was released on bond later that day, but the damage was done. The local news picked up the story, running a piece about HOA overreach and abuse of authority. The HOA board finally acted. At the next meeting, they voted unanimously to remove Patricia as president. She was allowed to stay on as a regular board member until the end of her term, but she had no authority to make policy or enforce rules. They also voted to rescind the mandatory snow removal policy and refund everyone who had paid the fee. David called me with an update on my attorney fees. "The HOA cut a check for $3,000 to cover your costs. That should cover my fees and leave you a little extra for your trouble. That's generous of them. They're trying to avoid a lawsuit." Between the false police report, the harassment, and the bad publicity, they know they're vulnerable. If you wanted to sue them for damages, you'd probably win. I thought about it, but I decided against it. I had already spent enough time and energy on this situation. I just wanted to move on with my life. Patricia's criminal case went to trial 4 months later. I was called to testify, along with the 2 officers who had responded to her call and Detective Martinez. The trial lasted 2 days, and it was clear from the beginning that Patricia's defense was not going well. Her lawyer tried to argue that she had genuinely believed I was using HOA equipment, but the email evidence and my documented photos contradicted that. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before finding her guilty of filing a false police report. The judge sentenced her to 6 months of probation, 100 hours of community service, and ordered her to pay restitution to the police department for the cost of investigating her false report. She was also permanently removed from the HOA board. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal after that. A new HOA president was elected, a retired engineer named Tom Brennan, who had a reputation for being fair and reasonable. One of his first acts was to commission a full review of all property deeds in the neighborhood to identify which homes had easements or special provisions. Turns out there were 8 properties total, including mine, that had various exemptions from certain HOA rules. Tom sent out a letter to all residents explaining the findings and apologizing for the previous board's overreach. He also instituted new policies requiring the board to consult with a real estate attorney before implementing any mandatory fees or services. The difference was immediate and dramatic. People actually started showing up to HOA meetings again because they trusted that their concerns would be heard. Marcus stopped by my house one evening that summer with a 6-pack of beer. We sat on my back deck watching the sunset over the Flatirons, those iconic rock formations that made Boulder famous. "You know, you did us all a favor," Marcus said. "Before all this happened, I think most of us just assumed the HOA could do whatever it wanted. Now people actually read the bylaws and ask questions." "I just wanted to clear my own driveway," I said. "Yeah, but you stood up to someone who needed to be stood up to. That matters." We drank our beer and talked about other things, normal things that had nothing to do with HOAs or legal battles. It felt good to just be a regular neighbor again instead of the guy fighting with the HOA. I ran into Patricia one more time, about 6 months after her trial. I was at the grocery store, loading bags into my car, when I saw her pushing a cart through the parking lot. She saw me too, and for a moment we just looked at each other. I expected anger or resentment, but what I saw was something else. She looked tired and smaller somehow, like the fight had gone out of her. She nodded at me slightly, and I nodded back. Neither of us said anything. There was nothing to say. She pushed her cart toward her car, and I finished loading my groceries and drove home. The whole experience taught me something important about standing up for yourself. It would have been easier to just pay the fee to go along with what Patricia wanted, to avoid the conflict. A lot of people did exactly that. But sometimes the easy path is not the right path. Sometimes you have to be willing to fight for what is right, even when it is difficult and stressful and takes over your life for a while. The legal principle at stake was clear from the beginning. My property had documented rights that predated the HOA, and those rights were legally binding. The HOA had no authority to override them, no matter how much Patricia wanted to believe otherwise. Judge Hartwell understood that immediately, which is why she dismissed the case so decisively. But beyond the legal principle, there was something deeper. Patricia had used her position of authority to bully and harass residents who disagreed with her. She had abused the HOA system, turning it from a tool for maintaining the neighborhood into a weapon for enforcing her personal vision of how things should be. That kind of abuse of power needs to be challenged, whether it is happening in a small neighborhood HOA or at much higher levels of government and business. The criminal charges were the natural consequence of her actions. When she filed that false police report, she crossed a line from being an overzealous HOA president into actually breaking the law. The fact that she did it to harass me into compliance made it even worse. The legal system did exactly what it was supposed to do in that situation. It held her accountable. I still live in the same house in Boulder. I still clear my own driveway when it snows, using the same snowblower I have had for years. The HOA leaves me alone now, and I pay my regular dues without complaint because they are legitimate and reasonable. Tom Brennan runs the HOA with transparency and common sense, and neighborhood relations have never been better. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I had just paid that first fee. Patricia would have gotten away with her overreach, and she probably would have found other ways to push boundaries and abuse her authority. Other residents would have continued to be intimidated and harassed. The whole neighborhood would have lived under her thumb, afraid to speak up or question anything. Instead, one person standing up created a ripple effect. Other residents found their courage. The board was reformed. Policies were changed. And a woman who abused her power faced real consequences for her actions. That is how systems get better. One person at a time refusing to accept what is wrong. My property deed sits in my fireproof safe, along with all the other important documents. I had it professionally authenticated and recorded with the county clerk after everything happened, just to make sure there was no question about its validity. That piece of paper, with its dry legal language about easements and property rights, turned out to be the most important document I owned. It represented not just my right to clear my own snow, but my right to stand up to unjust authority. The story spread beyond our neighborhood. I got calls from people in other HOA communities dealing with similar problems, asking for advice on how to fight back against overreaching boards. I always told them the same thing. Know your rights, document everything, and do not be afraid to stand up for what is right. Most property disputes can be resolved by carefully reading the actual legal documents instead of just accepting what the HOA claims is true. One guy from Denver called me about 6 months after my case was resolved. His HOA was trying to force him to remove a garden shed that he had built with proper permits, claiming it violated HOA rules. I told him to check his deed and the original HOA covenants carefully. He called me back a week later, elated. Turns out his property, like mine, had an easement that gave him more freedom than the HOA wanted to admit. He successfully fought off the HOA's demands, and they even apologized once he showed them the documentation. The media attention from my case helped too. Local newspapers ran stories about HOA overreach, and a few state legislators started talking about reforms to HOA laws in Colorado. There was discussion about requiring HOAs to have better oversight, mandatory arbitration before legal action, and penalties for boards that acted in bad faith. I testified at a State House committee hearing about my experience, and while the legislative process moved slowly, it at least started a conversation about protecting homeowner rights. What surprised me most through all of this was how many people were dealing with similar problems, but felt powerless to do anything about it. I heard stories of HOAs fining people thousands of dollars for minor violations, refusing to approve reasonable home modifications, and generally making residents' lives miserable. The common thread was that most people felt they had no choice but to comply, even when what the HOA was doing seemed wrong or illegal. That feeling of powerlessness is exactly what people like Patricia count on. They know that most people will not fight back because it is expensive, time-consuming, and stressful. They use that knowledge to push boundaries and expand their authority beyond what the law actually allows. It is a form of institutional bullying, and it only stops when someone has the resources and determination to stand up and say no. I was lucky in a lot of ways. I had a clear legal case thanks to the easement in my deed. I had the financial means to hire a good attorney. I had the emotional support of neighbors and friends who believed I was doing the right thing. Not everyone has those advantages, and I am aware that my ability to fight back was partly a function of privilege. But even knowing that, I think the principle holds true for everyone. You do not have to just accept it when someone in authority treats you unfairly. There are legal protections and remedies available, even if they are not always easy to access. The key is knowing your rights and being willing to assert them. The snowstorms came and went that winter and the next, and the one after that. Every time I fired up my snowblower and cleared my driveway, I thought about how a simple dispute over snow removal had turned into a much bigger battle over property rights and abuse of authority. It seemed almost comical in retrospect, except for the fact that Patricia had been willing to file false police reports and rack up thousands of dollars in legal fees for the HOA, all because she could not accept that she did not have absolute authority over every property in the neighborhood. My relationship with the HOA now is what it should have been all along, mutually respectful and bounded by clear rules. I pay my dues, I follow the legitimate rules that apply to my property, and the HOA leaves me alone to maintain my home as I see fit within those rules. It is not complicated when everyone acts in good faith and respects the actual legal framework. Tom Brennan turned out to be exactly the kind of leader the HOA needed. He was organized without being controlling, attentive to details without being petty, and always willing to listen to residents' concerns. Under his leadership, the HOA focused on actual community needs like maintaining common areas, organizing neighborhood events, and addressing legitimate safety concerns. It was amazing how much better things worked when the person in charge was interested in serving the community instead of controlling it. I eventually became friends with Tom and his wife, Linda. They lived about a mile away in a different part of the neighborhood, and we started getting together for dinner every month or so. Tom told me that he had been approached about running for HOA president several times before, but had always declined because he did not want to deal with the drama. After everything that happened with Patricia, he felt like he needed to step up and help restore people's faith in the HOA system. The thing about HOAs, Tom said one evening over steaks on his patio, is that they can be really useful when they're run properly. Shared maintenance, community standards, that all make sense. But the moment you get someone in charge who sees it as a power trip instead of a service role, everything goes sideways. Patricia definitely saw it as a power trip, I said. Oh, absolutely. I talked to her once about a year before you moved in. She had this whole vision of turning our neighborhood into some kind of showcase community with all these strict rules. I told her people moved here because they liked the casual, friendly vibe, not because they wanted to live in a gated community with a million restrictions. She did not want to hear it. Linda refilled our wine glasses. The scary thing is how many people supported her at first. They liked the idea of having someone who would crack down on people who did not mow their lawns often enough or had an old car parked in their driveway. They did not realize she was going to turn that same enforcement mentality on everyone. That is what happens when you give someone unchecked authority, I said. Even people who start with good intentions can get corrupted by it. The conversation drifted to other topics, but I kept thinking about what they had said. The HOA system itself was not the problem. The problem was how easily it could be abused by the wrong person in the wrong position. That was why it was so important to have oversight, transparency, and the willingness of residents to push back when things went wrong. I also learned something about the legal system through this experience. It is not perfect, and it definitely favors people who have the resources to navigate it. But when you have a clear case and you present it properly, the system can work. Judge Hartwell looked at the facts, applied the law correctly, and made the right decision. The district attorney pursued criminal charges when they were warranted. The police investigated thoroughly. All of those institutions did their jobs, and the result was justice. That does not always happen, and I know plenty of people have had experiences where the legal system failed them. But in my case, it worked the way it is supposed to work, and that gave me faith that standing up for your rights can actually make a difference. The attorney fees that the HOA paid covered David's costs, and then some, as he had predicted. I used the extra money to make a donation to a local legal aid organization that helps people who cannot afford attorneys in disputes with landlords and HOAs. It seemed like the right thing to do, a way to pay forward the advantage I had in being able to afford good legal representation. Years passed, and life returned to normal. I got promoted at work. I dated someone for a while, though it did not work out. I adopted a dog named Murphy who liked to watch me clear the driveway in winter, his tail wagging as snow flew through the air. The neighborhood continued to evolve, with new families moving in and others moving out, but the fundamental character of the place remained the same: friendly, relaxed, and well-maintained without being oppressive. Patricia moved away about 2 years after her conviction. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and her husband sold their house and relocated to Arizona. I never found out if the move was related to everything that happened or just a coincidence, but either way, it felt like the final chapter closing on that whole saga. The house that Patricia used to live in was bought by a young couple with 2 kids and a golden retriever. They were friendly and low-key, exactly the kind of neighbors everyone wants. The first time I met them, they told me they had heard about the HOA drama from the previous owner disclosure and were relieved that things had calmed down. I assured them the current HOA was reasonable and that they should not have any problems as long as they kept up with basic maintenance. Every once in a while, I get contacted by journalists writing about HOA issues or by researchers studying property rights and community governance. I always tell them my story, not because I think I am special or did anything heroic, but because I think it illustrates important principles about standing up for your rights and holding authorities accountable. The truth is that what happened to me happens to people all over the country every day. HOA, landlords, local governments, employers, all kinds of institutions try to exert authority beyond what the law actually grants them. Most of the time, people go along with it because they do not know their rights or because fighting back seems too difficult. But every time someone does fight back successfully, it makes it a little bit easier for the next person. That is the real legacy of my dispute with Patricia and the Riverside Meadows HOA. It was not just about snow removal fees or property easements. It was about demonstrating that ordinary people can stand up to institutional power when they have the law on their side and the courage to follow through. It was about showing that abuse of authority has consequences, even when it happens at the level of a neighborhood HOA. Looking back now, several years later, I am glad I did not just pay that $375 fee. Not because of the money itself, but because of what accepting that unjust demand would have meant. It would have meant accepting that Patricia's version of reality was more important than the actual law. It would have meant teaching her that she could push residents around without consequence. It would have meant letting fear and intimidation win over justice and property rights. Instead, I stood my ground. I documented everything. I hired a good lawyer. I let the legal system work. And in the end, the truth came out. My deed was valid, the easement was enforceable, and the HOA had overstepped its authority. Judge Hartwell saw that immediately, and her decision vindicated not just my specific claim, but the broader principle that HOAs cannot simply do whatever they want regardless of what property deeds and the law actually say. The criminal conviction of Patricia sent an even stronger message. You cannot abuse your position of authority to harass and intimidate residents. You cannot file false police reports to try to force compliance. Those actions have consequences, both civil and criminal. The legal system holds people accountable for that kind of behavior, even when they are acting in their capacity as HOA president. I still live in Boulder, still in the same house with the same property deed in my safe. I still clear my own snow every winter, and I still appreciate the freedom to maintain my property the way I choose. The HOA respects my rights. I respect their legitimate authority, and we coexist peacefully. It is exactly how things should be. Sometimes on quiet winter evenings, when the snow is falling and the city is peaceful, I sit by my window and watch the flakes accumulate on my driveway. I think about all the drama and stress and legal battles that came from something as simple as snow removal. I think about Patricia and her need for control, Judge Hartwell and her patient wisdom, David and his skilled advocacy, Tom and his steady leadership. All of those people played roles in a story that ended the way it should have, with justice prevailing and rights being respected. And then I finish my coffee, put on my coat and boots, fire up my snowblower and clear my driveway myself. Because that is my right, it is written in my deed, and nobody can take that away from me. That simple act of clearing snow became a symbol of something much bigger. The right to stand up for yourself, to demand that authorities respect the law, and to refuse to be bullied by people who abuse their power. That is the story of how the HOA called the police when I refused to pay snow removal fees, and how the judge laughed when I showed him my deed. But it is also a story about courage, persistence, and the importance of knowing your rights. It is a story about how systems can be corrupted by the wrong people and reformed by standing up to abuse. And it is a story that I hope encourages others facing similar situations to stand their ground and fight for what is right, because sometimes one person really can make a difference.